Well, with me in the studio at this hour, Benjamin Anthony is the CEO of the Miriam Institute. We're also joined in the studio by our Middle East correspondent, Areial. And as we heard there, Areial, 74 days in already, aren't we yet? Hamas still has the capability to fire rockets at central Israel.
They still have the capability, but we need to make sure that we analyze this correctly, because they will continue to fire rockets until the last day of the war, whether this is a 100-day war or a 100-year war. What they will do is they will spread it out, and that's why we haven't seen rocket fire to central Israel over the past 8 days, because they're conserving the capabilities. Same thing with launching towards Jerusalem a few days ago, first time in a month and a half. And so if it were up to them, they would fire at Tel Aviv every day, perhaps even twice, 3 times a day, as we saw in the beginning of the war. But now, as the war is prolonging and there is no real end date in sight, so they're trying to conserve their capabilities. They launched, since the start of the war, 12,500 rockets towards Israel. They have about double that amount in their arsenal, perhaps even more, and so we shouldn't be surprised that they continue to fire at central Israel or at Israel in general. But we do need to look at how the rate of fire, the pace, and according to that, see what their capabilities are. They still can fire at central Israel. They can fire still at northern Israel. They can reach all the way to Eilat. But the fact that the ground operation is hindering those abilities, as well as Israel's aerial superiority, it is limiting their capability, but they definitely have it if they choose to use it.
All right, thanks, Areial. So, Benjamin Anthony, the fighting continues. The rocket fire has slowed down substantially, but the terrorists are still getting aid, aren't they? They are still getting food and fuel, which is coming via Egypt and now via Israel as well.
Yeah, the terrorists are still getting aid, and also the broader citizenry over there in the Gaza Strip is receiving aid. There's a constant call for an increase in that aid in order to prevent what has been described as a pending humanitarian crisis. I actually think that needs to be looked at and reviewed. The fact of the matter is that part of the reason that aid went in was that there would be, in return for that humanitarian gesture, the humanitarian gesture of the return of our hostages who were taken on October the 7th. Now that's stopped, it's been paused, and I think until that starts again, the aid needs to be more heavily conditioned, quite frankly, because it's on that Sinwar and other leaders of Hamas are depending in order to calm their citizenry over there inside the Gaza Strip. I also want to say that we've just seen rockets being fired here towards central Israel. No surprise, it was very well analysed just a moment ago. Obviously, the ground forces are impeding the ability of Hamas to launch those rockets. But what we should all take some encouragement from is the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that there is pressure right now coming from the Americans to stop or bring about a pause in the fighting, or even affix a timeline to the fighting. We had Lloyd Austin here yesterday speaking with Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, his American counterpart, of course, Lloyd Austin, the American Secretary of Defense, and he said this is Israel's war and he is not here to affix a timeline. I think we should take them at their word and be encouraged by the fact that we have room to maneuver and smash this enemy over there in the Gaza Strip.
Yes, because Western leaders are under a lot of pressure with these noisy protests, aren't they, week after week. They're trying to make sure that it looks as though they're also acting in assistance of the Palestinian civilians. You've also heard from the British Prime Minister, the French President, calling for a ceasefire, but perhaps now is not the right time. That's how they're putting it.
Now's definitely not the right time. There's no question but for our need to continue to push on, press this offensive. We cannot have a situation where Hamas comes in, murders 1,300 innocents, kidnaps 240 members of our society, and thinks that they can walk away and survive such an attack. They have to be destroyed, they have to be pushed back, and it's incredible because the state of Israel, which has known war since the day of its inception, has never faced a dynamic where we've had 1,300 citizens killed and never faced a dynamic where we've had 240 hostages. Nor have any of these other countries throughout Europe and elsewhere, yet with incredible temerity, these countries now turn to us and tell us how we have to fight, under what terms we ought to fight, and when we should stop the fighting. And I think actually they should apply just a little bit of humility and a little bit of compassion and understanding to the one democracy here in the Middle East and continue to give us the room to maneuver. But remember one last thing, we're not asking them for permission. We're working with them, we're doing everything we can in order to placate the pressures that they feel at home. It's nothing compared to the pressure we have to end the days of this enemy in the Gaza Strip.
All right, Benjamin, thank you. And Areial, Israel is perhaps not asking for assistance from Europe, but it is dependent on the United States to restock its military capacities. In terms of the American pressure on Israel to do everything it can to limit civilian casualties and all the rest of it, is that hindering Israel's progress in the war, and is it contributing to that very heavy death toll of Israeli troops?
I don't think so. I think what is, if we're looking at the immediate translation of American pressure, that is more in the likes of increasing the capacity of humanitarian aid that enters the Gaza Strip. Yesterday, we're talking about over 196, if I'm not mistaken, humanitarian aid trucks entering the Gaza Strip. This is after Israel allowed for trucks to enter Gaza directly through the Kerem Shalom crossing that opened just last week for the first time since the start of the war. And so while we're hearing, I think if we want to get the best understanding as to the sense in the Biden administration regarding Israel's advancements, we need to listen to the Pentagon spokesperson, John Kirby. I think he is illustrating in a very clear manner what is being portrayed by the Biden administration, and that is a continuous call to Israel to avoid civilian casualties. Kirby said himself, we know that Israel is trying its best to reduce it, and we continue to remind Israel or reiterate the importance of that. So in terms of that issue, there doesn't seem to be any disagreement between Israel and the Biden administration. I think the Americans would like to see more in the form of humanitarian aid going in, and obviously they would not like to see this drag on for months and months on end. They do want to see this end sooner rather than later.
Is that a problem, though, putting a time limit on any kind of conflict? I mean, it reminded me of Afghanistan, when the Taliban kind of had advance notice of when the Americans were going to leave. So, you know, that very much worked in their favour. Do you see a similar situation with Hamas?
Yes, I do. I think it's very problematic when we telegraph the idea that we're going to bring the most intense portion of this fight into a close by a certain date. People are talking about January, February. I don't know whether that will be or won't be. But we know that Hamas watches our media. We know that it analyzes the statements of our politicians. We know that it affects strategy in part as a consequence of what it garners from our public statements. The reality of the matter is there does not need to be a timeline here. What there needs to be is a determined push to destroy an enemy that is committed to destroying the state and the people of Israel. That's point number one. And on the point of endangering the lives of our soldiers, one thing that I'm hearing murmurs about is the notion of returning Gazan civilians back up to the areas that the Israel Defense Forces now controls, most specifically Bet Hanun over there in the northern Gaza Strip, which is the first area that we began operating in. You start bringing civilians from Gaza back to those areas, you start to endanger the lives of our soldiers. It massively complicates our freedom of maneuver over in those areas. And one final note about that, we may say that we control that area, but there are still terrorists there. People can still come out with RPGs. People can still come out and launch attacks against our troops. We have to make sure that we have room to maneuver there without the encumbrance of Gazan civilians being moved back up north.
I agree with everything that was said regarding projecting to the enemy our timeline, Israel's timeline. Militarily, that is correct. However, there is another aspect here, and that is over 100,000 internally displaced Israelis who do not know when they will be able to go home, how long they will be able to stay in these hotels, or some are already starting to move to more temporary accommodations like apartment buildings in central Israel. These people, they don't know when they're going to go back home. They cannot plan their lives, and so I think this is one of the internal challenges of a democratic state. On the one hand, you want to keep some veil of secrecy regarding your military intentions, but as far as your civilians are concerned, there does need to be some sort of transparency regarding what their future is going to look like, given that they've already paid such a heavy toll, and to this day, no one has told them when they're going to go back or when they may be able to go back.
But keep in mind, you're absolutely right. Keep in mind, however, and you've raised a very important dilemma. One doesn't necessarily preclude the other. We can carry on intensively fighting inside the Gaza Strip, and because of the success of that fighting, potentially move people back to homes in the south.
No, for sure, but they don't know when that's going to happen.
They don't know when, but it may be that the intense fighting facilitates their return. I rather suggest it does.
I completely agree with that.